Hello and welcome to the complete guide to beat the French defense. We're going to be taking a look in this video on the Tarrasch defense, which is e4, e6, d4, d5, and now knight to d2. I'll be walking you through all of the important variations you need to know. Specifically, we're going to be covering the least critical, which is pawn takes, and then the main moves of knight to f6 and c5. As always, there is a timeline and a PGN file down below in the description. You're watching the Chess Geek channel. We upload every other day, so make sure you subscribe. And without any further ado, let's jump in. So the French defense begins after e4, black plays e6 with the intention to meet d4 with the explosive d5. Now in this position, there is obviously some tension going on and we need to find a way to defend this pawn. And the very typical and normal looking knight to c3 comes with a big drawback. It means that we can never play the pawn to c3 now, and that means that this pawn here on d4 is going to be permanently weak. So this is where the Tarrasch with knight to d2 comes in handy. We still secure this pawn, but we also keep open the possibility to play c3 and secure the other pawn. You might be looking at this and wondering, what about the bishop? Aren't we harming our other development? And that is true, but this is a temporary issue. Eventually, this knight will not stay here. It will be rerouted either to f3 or to b3 and get into the game, which would later allow this bishop to also enter the game. You're going to see this throughout the video as well. So that is conceptually what we're going for. Now, practically, what does this actually look like? Well, let's take a look at pawn takes pawn. Now, this completely releases the tension. It's not a common move, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly. We're going to take back, and one of the things that you should notice already is that, well, this pawn here is now uncontested. Black no longer has the pawn on d5, and so we have a better center control that's not contested whatsoever. This is a really positive position for us, and it's one of those positions that is at no risk of losing. And in fact, I mean, you can see this. They're going to develop the knight. We can even choose to just take and develop our pieces. And because of this pawn on d4, which we can always secure with c3, as you're going to see, for example, in this position, pawn to c3, this is basically the structure you go for. You go for this pawn pyramid here. The knight and the bishop develop very normally. This bishop will be able to activate, and you just have a game where you have more space in the center and therefore can control the narrative of the story. Now, one of the key maneuvers that I also want to introduce you to, because their pawn has gone from d5, this square on e4 is very weak. And so this maneuver of knight to d2, knight e4 is very typical in these sort of positions. And I have an example game already to kind of illustrate this point. And so in this position, for example, knight to e4 has been played a couple of times. And further, after the queen moves, you can continue exploding open the center with the move like f4. Now, alternatively, with the knight on d2, it also has access to c4. And this is sort of what you're going to see in this game. So we have d5, and then we have f4, like I mentioned. And now knight to c4, the knight activates, putting some pressure on the center, and you can already see that white is the one with the initiative controlling how the story and the game goes. We already have this move now tying down the queen if the queen ever leaves, or there's going to be some issues over here on h6, and therefore the rook is tied down to the pawn, the queen is tied down to this pawn. We're the ones that are causing the issues in the game, and they're the ones that are always having to defend. The rook ends up infiltrating, and very calmly, white gets a passed pawn and promotes this passed pawn by playing queen to d1 here. If you were to trade queens, there is now no way to stop this pawn from running down the board. So this is how I recommend you deal with if they were to capture. It's a very peaceful situation. You're never at any risk whatsoever. You're always the one with the initiative, and likely it's either going to end up as a draw or you're going to win. So this is a very easy way to deal with the French if they choose to take, which is why black usually keeps the tension and plays either c5 or the move that we're going to start by looking at, knight to f6. Now, the second the knight comes here, we have the opportunity to push, close the center with tempo. We're going to take this opportunity, e5. They're going to reroute the knight to d7, where it will help with their pawn push c5 coming up. Now, the reason that c5 is no longer as dangerous in the Tarrasch is because, exactly like I mentioned, we're going to be able to meet that move with c3. And this is exactly what happens. So knight to d7, we're going to develop our bishop, bishop to d3, c5, and c3. Another benefit of c3, if they were to close the pawn, now this bishop has the ability, if it wants, to stay on this diagonal, because this diagonal is now open, the center and is closed, and so we can try to launch an attack on the king side, and the bishop could be a very useful piece. So that's another one of the key maneuvers. The bishop can hop back to c2 in this sort of position. So they're probably going to maintain the tension in the center. So we're going to continue by, after knight to c6, simply going knight to e2. Now this is another important move and another important motif in the Tarrasch French. You likely are going to put the knight on e2, and this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, the knight on f3 is not as important as it usually is, because this knight anyways can come to f3 at a later time, and so likely you're going to see a knight coming to f3. And so the benefit with the knight on e2 is it can come to f4, and this f4 square is super critical in the French. It really ties down black's position, because it makes this breakthrough with f6 far less effective, because the pawn on e6 will be in danger. Also, in view of f6, we're going to have ideas of queen h5 check now with the knight guarding over g6, and you're going to see these pieces sort of come together very, very soon. For example, if they go f6, guess what we play? We're going to go knight f4. And after they continue, if they were, for example, to take, we're going to be able to take over here on e6 and then launch the queen over and continuously just attack and completely infiltrate. This is not really a question whatsoever. Alternatively, if they were to take the other pawn and defend over e6, well, here's the other bonus. Again, queen h5 comes with some deadly effect. In this position, they have to move their king. And, practically speaking, the engine shows this as fine for black if they find the move king f7 in this position, holding everything together. But this is a crazy situation. Practically, this is much, much better for white. You have such an easy game here. You're at no risk whatsoever. Materially, you're better. Positionally, you're better. The king is misplaced. You can choose to castle and then launch this pawn. Get your other pieces into the game. You can see how vulnerable this king really is. This is a fun position to be able to play as white. And I mean, they can play other moves like knight to b6 to defend, but again, we're going to infiltrate. In fact, the only move in this position that holds things together is the one we just saw with knight takes here, which, as I showed, is very dangerous for black anyways, where they have to find this weird resource of king e7 and then king f7 later. It's a weird position and a very difficult one for black to find over the board. So this is one of the powerful ideas of the French. You're going to be able to bring the knight into the game. But of course, this is only in view of f6. What if they just develop their bishop? Well, we're still going to get this idea of bringing the knight into the game. For example, we're going to castle. They're going to castle. Queen to c2. They're going to have to defend, let's say h6, a3. And in this position after f6, well, guess what? We can take, and knight to f3, and eventually bring the knight back. And again, you can kind of see how the momentum is clearly on white's side. I mean, the bishop, once it develops, we get the rook. There's a lot of pressure on e6, a lot of pressure on the weak light squares here. The knight can come to g6, the bishop can come to g6. I mean, we're the ones that have all the potential in this position. And a lot of that stems from our superior placement of the knight. This maneuver of going knight d2 and then knight e2 is really powerful, especially combined with our superior control of the center with the pawn on d4. We get a lot of fun play. Now, I have another example game that I want to illustrate now. If they play f6, my recommendation was to go knight f4. In the example game, they took, but very soon and shortly, then they went and placed the knight on f4, and it's a similar idea. You're still adding the same pressure that we had before. The knight comes to e4, the knight retreats in an attempt to eventually, for example, if they don't go for the sacrifice, they play something random, we're going to be able to take and then bring the other knight back, and this pawn is going to be hanging. It's impossible to defend because this knight controls over f4. And so you can see the knights kind of working together in the game. Because the knights are so powerful, black was kind of tempted into this rook sacrifice, this exchange sacrifice. But this is just, it doesn't work whatsoever. A nice tactic here, using the pin and putting more pressure on the center pawn here. We have even more pressure coming in. and eventually, white continues to break through. And this game was quite special because of this ending of rook h6, a nice little sacrifice to win the queen and go on to win the game in quite convincing fashion. I mean, this is a very easy conversion with the queen. I mean, you can just slowly maneuver and eventually the game will be sealed. And so this is again kind of the idea of the knights being so powerful, so black had to sacrifice for them, because otherwise, I mean, you can see the knight is attacked, so it retreated, but it could easily reroute back into the game. As I showed, takes, and then this pawn is weak. You can add even more pressure to the pawn. Slowly, the knights are going to take over the center, and from then, take over the game. So this is all my recommendation against knight to f6. We lock up the center. We control the center with c3. If they take, we're going to take, and then the knights do all the work, right? The knights come to f3, to f4, and put pressure on the center and the king side. But what about the much more immediate c5? Now, this is a very confrontational way to play. I mean, black is immediately going for an aggressive option, and the main move here is not what I'm going to recommend. The main move is knight to f3. But one of the issues with this move is that if black is very strategic, they can now play knight f6, force us to go e5, or encourage us to go e5, and then they transpose into a situation that we just saw with this maneuver of the knight. Only in those positions, I always recommended we want the knight on e2, not on f3, so black kind of tricked us here. And for this reason, to avoid this, after they go for the immediate c5, my recommendation is just to take the pawn in the center, right? And then after they take, for example, if they take with the pawn, now we can bring the knight to f3 because there's no longer this idea of going e5. The position is completely changed in nature, and we have the ability to now place the knight on f3 with no drawback whatsoever. We control the center, and just one of the ways this sort of position can develop, and again, we'll illustrate this with a game example here. White castled. They brought the rook to e1, and that is very typical. You'll very soon see this idea of going c3, even not to defend the pawn. It's just a great way to restrict this pawn from ever coming forward, to bring the d4 square into the complete possession of the white pieces, and it's just a good way to control the position holistically. I mean, even the queen gets a nice square now. And one of the important things that you should notice here is this isolated pawn in the center. The second that we took over here, we always had the ability to take once again and isolate their pawn. And you can play this right now immediately. You can wait a little bit like what white did, but ultimately that's what you're going for in this sort of position with the white pieces. You're playing against the isolated and weak pawn, and this is exactly what white did here, and they did it beautifully. I mean, you can see the queen attacks the pawn, the knight attacks the pawn, the rooks are soon going to make contact as well. We have a trade now, the other knight, the rook as well. I mean, this pawn is lost. There's no way to defend it successfully. They decided to take here, which is logical, but now there's even another weakness over here. This weakness is still very difficult to defend from, and you can see that white very, very calmly manages to convert this. There's a little bit of repetition, perhaps for some time, but then queen to d3 with the idea of meeting queen to h3 with queen to f1. If you were to take, there's going to be very big issues. How can you defend this pawn, especially with the potential ideas, in fact, of going, for example, of f4 at some point. You can also attack this other pawn. I mean, this is one of those low-risk positions. You can set up by an idea of going b3 and then c4. If the rook comes here, then there's going to be some pinning ideas. This is a pretty easy conversion for white to do. At the very least, you're never risking a loss, right? So it's a very fun and smooth way to play. And in fact, in the game, black decided not to go for the trade, but that doesn't change the situation whatsoever. There's still this huge weakness that's hard to defend from, and slowly, black managed to lose the pawn, and eventually white crashed through. And in this endgame, still some complications, but ultimately white managed to win. And so the final option I want to look at is after c5 and takes, what about queen takes? This is not so common, and for good reason. I mean, the queen is now way more vulnerable than it would otherwise be. And the way that we beat this is quite easy. We're going to try to use this queen for tempo. So bishop c4 is the idea we're going for, but then the pawn hangs. So first, we're going to defend that pawn. Again, knight f3. We can play this now because there's no issues with knight to f6. And in fact, later the bishop comes in, and even sacrificing a pawn, it doesn't matter in this position. We're going to win it back immediately and use this queen again for a lot of tempo. It's a very tough position if the queen were to take, because we easily castle, and then all of our pieces come and swarm against the queen. I mean, the queen is really out of squares. More attacks. There's now this b4. You're going for a4, a5 perhaps. I mean, very difficult indeed. Now you hang on a7, and I mean, we can stop here. You can tell that white is completely controlling the story of the game, and there's no issues at all. And ladies and gentlemen, that is basically wrapping up our French defense video. Essentially, as a quick reminder, we go for the Tarrasch with knight to d2 to always keep open the possibility of further strengthening our center with c3, while also maintaining this maneuver with the knight to put the knight on f3 and the other one on f4, which gives us ultimate control on the center and king side. If they try to go for the very aggressive option, we're going to take and immediately transform the position into one with an isolated pawn, where we're the only ones that have a real shot at winning. And if alternatively they go for a more slower approach, well, then we again go for this knight maneuvering idea and get a lot of initiative. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure you subscribe for more content in the future. Like this video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.